Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another Canadian federal election forecast series update. So, just right off the bat here, I have done quite a bit of changes underlying the model since the US election results have been getting known. We don't know all of them yet, but we know enough that I can do changes. So, the biggest one I've changed here that really matters is I'm changed, once again, how I'm handling urbanicity. I think the result of the Quebec election made me go in the wrong direction for the US, which overestimated the significance of urbanicity in a way. Quebec, I kind of underestimated it, and then going into the US, I think wildly overestimated it, and also it made it a bit more complicated to address ridings, etc., etc. So I've changed it once again. This is how it's going to go until you tweak the results. And this change, along with the polling changes, there's been about 4 real polls. I guess there's been several nanos polls, but there's been 3 other polls other than nanos since the last update, so I figured it was a good time to do an update between those changes and this. So, with that, let's see what has changed. Well, you might notice I have introduced another level of color here, just so I can have a bit more distinguishing between some ridings, because not all of them are the same level of safeness. So this is now 40 plus margin, mostly a place reserved for Tories. You see rural Manitoba, rural Saskatchewan, rural Alberta, some parts of rural BC are all in this plus 40 margin. I think there is some ridings in Montreal that are like this for the Liberals, but I couldn't point them out to you because, to be honest, you probably can't see them very well on this map. It requires me to zoom in very closely to be able to see them myself. And you might also notice here that there's some gray ridings. These gray ones are ridings that I am introducing, because I kind of introduced this concept in the US one, of ones that are too close to call. So, in a sense, what I'm calling a riding too close to call, it's really within a quarter lead for the leading party. In the case of this guy here, I can't think of the name of this riding off my top of my head, but this riding here, right now, with 2021 turnout, my model says the Conservatives would win it by 14 votes. Hey, you heard that, 14. You might think, oh, that's unreasonable. No election's ever come down that close, and I will introduce you to Yukon, provincially, territorial election, where they had a race go down to a coin flip. So you can have very close races like that, and apparently my model is forecasting this one is going to be incredibly close. So overall here we have interesting race. So the other big ones are Labrador, which is always very close. It seems to be a very much a riding where individual candidates and individual campaigns matter a lot. It is very flippy. Right now it is slightly conservative, but it's too close to call. And then we have Saanich, Gulf Islands, which are also slightly leaning conservative, though that is not to say much because it is a 4-way tie. I will note that all these really too close to call ridings are included with the party that's technically leading in the seat total. So the seat total does reflect them, but I do not think it's fair to graphically represent them at this point as a color, because that kind of misrepresents where this is. My model's precision and accuracy is really not enough to call these ridings. So I will not go, I will in seat totals, but I will not on map. So that is a compromise I'm going with. But in general, we have a couple things that have lightly changed, mostly because of how I'm changing urbanicity. So we're seeing the coast of BC over here is a bit less conservative. Not terribly surprising. Yukon's a bit less conservative. Again, same thing. A lot of these ridings became very conservative in my model because urbanicity changes from Quebec election really overplayed how important it was. Now I'm underplaying it a bit. Maybe. Northern Manitoba's going back to the NDP, which makes more sense to me. I thought that was a bit weird last time, so this feels better. Northern Ontario is no longer extremely safe. It's now close, and the NDP are now holding a Gloma something something, and sorry, people from there, can't pronounce all of the names. And the Liberals are now holding Thunder River Superior North. So again, not too surprising. Quebec actually is pretty flat, other than these Pontiac and Lake Champlain are slightly more liberal, which again, if you think about it, does kind of make sense. And the last big area changes were the Maritimes, where Madawack Resteditch, pronunciation, I apologize, is safe or liberal. Northern Nova Scotia is not fairly safe, conservative. It's now pretty close. It's a competitive seats, but right now Liberals are leading. And Newfoundland, like Avalon, is not as competitive seat for the Liberals. And these two ridings, I can't think of the name of them, are both competitive seats, but from the Conservative side. I might go, in future updates, I might change the coloring gradient to be stronger. Let me know in the comments below if you think the color gradient I'm using isn't clear enough. If so, well, I can make it, can change the relative saturation of colors to make it clearer. I'm not 100% myself, but I will defer to what the audience thinks. Now, there's a couple other ridings that are interesting here. So we have Beauport here, which is very close, narrow block lead, about less than 1 point. Then we have Niagara Center, London West, and this riding, again, I can't think of any of it. There's 338 of them, so sue me, are all within 1 point conservative lead over Liberals. So again, all very close races. So there's quite a few close races here, and there's quite a few too close to call races. I think overall that works out to be 7, and the Conservatives are in all 7 of them. So there is a decent amount of uncertainty here, and there's a bunch of ridings that are even just close by themselves. They're not extremely close, but still close. You have Fredericton, Cape Breton, and Cape Breton-Canso. This part of Quebec here. A couple parts of the GTA, like Mississauga Lakeshore, and that one, whatever that one is. I think it's Newmarket Aurora. Inner riding of Edmonton is very close. Cambridge is very close. Richmond is very close. Canada Carleton's also quite close. Again, we have Agloma here. We have Sudbury. And we have Powell, or these two parts of Victoria. Vancouver Island are very close. So there's quite a few very close ridings between too close to call, well within margin of error, and just close. We have 23. And the thing I really want to stress here is a lot of these ones that are really close are liberal conservative for the most part. Yes, you have places like Beauport and Trois-Rivières, which are conservative bloc, and you have places like Agloma, which are conservative NDP. Same thing with Vancouver Island. But there's quite a few that are liberal conservative swing. So even though right now the Conservatives are leading, this is not a very secure lead. I really want to stress upon this. I think I will get into this more when I do the US postmortem. I think one of the issues a lot of the discourse in the US had recently is there was a lot of leading, but people were overselling leads in actually key swing areas. And this is really important in Canada, because the Liberals are already extremely good at micro-targeting ridings and very good at creating a very specific platform that runs in very specific areas. In other words, a lot of these urban ridings, like in the GTA, GVA, we shouldn't be surprised if an election were to occur right now. Liberal micro-targeting might take these extremely marginal ridings and win all of them. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody here. The Conservatives have an initial advantage right now. Same thing with Canada Carleton, just to throw that one in there too. So there's 6 ridings here. I can just name, or 7 if you count the one that's Liberal favorite already, that are extremely marginal, and the Liberals likely should win them in an election because historically they've been really good at micro-targeting, really good at hitting these particular areas. Maybe Poilievre's campaign and his team will be ready to combat that, but barring changes in how Conservatives federally are targeting, how their platforms are running, how they're executing their campaigns, a minor Conservative lead in a district isn't much. When you're talking about 1 or 2 points, it's not, on a forecast model like this, it's not very significant because the micro-targeting and extremely specific election campaigning are kind of hard to model. It's not impossible if we had consistent riding level polls. I don't really consider riding level polls right now, but I might going forward just for this particular purpose. Though for now I'm currently not, because there isn't any, so there's no point in bothering to capture that. I might do the coding changes sometime in the near future to handle them, but for now I don't have any capacity to handle that because there's never been a need. So what I really want to press upon this is a good situation right now for Poilievre. He's set to win a comfortable minority, and he has the potential to pick up more seats still. The Conservatives, in a good campaign, could get somewhere between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 seats fairly trivially, and if you go further, they could probably get a majority. You start considering things like Pickering or Central Nova or Avalon or some of these other ones in the GVA. There's more seats. They have the potential to win a majority. It really depends on the campaign right now and where Poilievre's position is. Poilievre is running a much better train and a much better ship than O'Toole did, but what I really think we need to keep in mind here, especially following the US, is overall polling trends and popular vote numbers are not relevant. This is important. They're not very relevant. They're useful for creating this model, but you have to make sure you're interpreting this model correctly. And I will admit, I was interpreting my model wrong. There were some bugs in it that partially caused my interpretation, but I will get into that in the postmortem, which I think I'm going to do next week. I need to have all the seats counted, and there's still a bunch in California being counted in Arizona. So I can't really do anything until that happens because I can't really know what level of miss I'm talking about, so I can figure out what's going on. But again, we got to keep in mind this. It's very easy to convince yourself of a result. So we got to keep in mind on this. That said, though, the situation in Canada is very favorable. We are looking at consistently the Conservatives are leading in the polls. And in a lot of these polls, they're leading in Ontario as a whole, which is promising. We go with a relatively neutral pollster. I say neutral because they don't typically favor the Conservatives overwhelmingly. That is, or anyone overwhelmingly, I would say, that we have Abacus here. So we go to this Abacus poll, and what do we see? They have the Conservatives up by 3. Now they have some places like BC and Atlantic are very marginal. Actually, Atlantic would be terrible. But I don't really put too much stock in raw Atlantic polling numbers from being from here. I think a lot of them are wrong. But that's not here nor there. The big one here is we have a lot of polls going on that have Ontario being extremely competitive for the Conservatives. And this is really important if you want the Conservatives to win. As long as Quebec is pretty much a non-issue for the Conservatives, in that they can't win it, or convert many seats in Quebec, Ontario is a necessity. Because even if the Conservatives won every seat outside of Quebec and Ontario, you still couldn't form a majority government because Quebec and Ontario together are 199 seats. You need a lot of seats in one of those two. So the Conservatives doing better in Ontario than under O'Toole is good. It is something that is pushing on the right track. And overall, the campaign, it's not really a proper campaign, it's not an election right now, but the leadership done by Poilievre here is likely to yield better results. He's much more focused, he's much more clear platform, a much more clear goal, and he's putting an affirmative vision to vote for. Remember, this is really important. People really underestimate this a lot. People vote for things. Yes, anti-voters exist, but anti-voters almost never decide an election. And what a lot of times, or what has happened a lot recently in the last 20, 30 years, is anti-voting is very clear and easy to do. It's very easy to push an anti-campaign. It's easy to tar and feather somebody. It's easy to make fun of someone, attack them, denigrate them. That's easy. It's a lot harder to put an affirmative vision for why you should vote for me. Why should you like me? That's a lot harder. But the thing is, a positive, affirmative campaign with a vision of what Canada should be or should go to or should become, something aspirational, is a lot more effective of a campaigning strategy because it's easier to motivate someone to vote for something. If people are excited to vote for you because they think you're going to do something good, they're more likely to actually vote. And this really matters in Canada because get out the vote is a lot more important here because we don't, for the most part, almost all ballots are pen and paper at precinct, which is good. That's a better way to do voting, but that's most ballots, almost all of them. People who are anti-voting are less likely to turn out. It's a lot harder to motivate yourself to go put a check mark beside blue if you don't like blue as much as you don't like red. Or vice versa. That is a much harder sell. And I can even say this from personal experience. It was hard to motivate myself to go vote in 2021 because I didn't like anybody. At least anyone who had a chance of winning. And if you think about this to yourself and to people you've talked to, you'll probably quickly realize that I am correct on this. People don't want to vote against somebody. And that's why you see like 2008, 2006, 2011 were relatively low turnout elections because, while effective in those particular elections, Harper ran a very negative campaign. The Liberals just didn't have anything. They weren't really running a good campaign at all. And until 2011, the NDP Jack Layton hadn't really hit his stride yet until 2011, so he didn't really have what his messaging and what his campaigning should be. And if it wasn't for the fact that Jack Layton did hit his messaging and his brand and all that stuff in 2019 or 2011, it's very likely the turnout would have been even lower than it was. And it was already relatively low at 61%, which is not terrible in the grand scheme of Canada, but it's a relatively low turnout election. And it likely would have been worse if Layton ran a negative campaign. He ran a more aspirational one. And a lot of people at the time who aren't normal NDP voters were considering or did in fact vote for him. And then you replace him with Mulcair, who kind of ran a middling campaign. Then you replace him with Singh, who almost entirely runs a weirdly micro-targeted anti-campaign. You might be like, but wait, Bagel, doesn't Singh's campaign, he's campaigning on public pharmacare, public dental care. Yes, but you look at a lot of his messaging, and it's conservatives are bad. It's not, we should do this. It's conservatives are bad. Right now he's doing a lot of liberals are bad too, which is rich considering he's in a coalition government with them. But that is a negative campaign. He's not presenting an alternate NDP vision of Canada. He's picturing liberals, but more. If that makes sense. The reason why Singh is doing really bad as a leader for the NDP isn't because necessarily he's a bad leader or a bad speaker or he has bad ideas. You may or may not think he's bad at any of those columns, but that's not the problem. His problem is in 2021 and 2019, his campaign was very much, this is what the liberals are doing, we're doing that plus one. That's not an affirmative vision. That's not a contrasting vision. That's not a different vision. That is, we are liberals, but more liberal. You do not win an election, you do not perform well by saying, we are the same people, but we're more of it. That is not a successful vision. That's why the NDP has been pretty much shut out of Toronto, why it's been shut out of, or it's being shut out of smaller cities like London and Windsor and Hamilton. Places that were traditionally NDP strongholds. It's why they're doing bad on the coast of BC. It's why they're doing bad in Northern Ontario. And for a while, the Liberals were superseding them, and now the Conservatives seem to be coming in and taking the ground. The reason for this NDP abject failure is not just things intrinsic to Singh, in his rhetoric, in his positions, in what his platforms are. It's not just that. It's naive to think the NDP is doing bad because now all of a sudden the NDP is too left-wing for Canadians. That's not the issue. And in fact, I would go so far as to say the average voter really doesn't care, ideologically speaking, left or right. I've talked to a lot of people who are swing NDP conservatives right now. But in previous elections, they were swing NDP liberal, or they were swing liberal conservative. How does that make sense? Well, people go from one affirmative vision to a different one. People vote for things. But the thing is, what your agenda is, what you are portraying, what you are selling to voters has to be different. If it's the same, you're going to do bad. That's one of the reasons, I would say the principal reason, more than anything else, why in 2021, the Conservatives underperformed 2019. It's not just that they lost. It wasn't per se O'Toole in himself. It wasn't his speaking. It wasn't his performance in debates. It wasn't, strictly speaking, his platform. Though his flip-flop on guns definitely hurt him a lot. The big difference between Scheer's performance and O'Toole's performance is best captured in that Scheer, well, not differentiated enough, was more differentiated from the Liberals than O'Toole was. O'Toole ran as almost entirely a centrist on economic issues, and only vaguely right-wing on social issues. And when I say vaguely, I mean like if we talk about a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being completely conservative and 0 being completely liberal, he was like a 6 on social issues. And by that, principally, his initial platform was going to overturn the gun ban. That was pretty much where his social conservatism ended. And then he flip-flopped on that, and then he just became a complete centrist. That's why he lost. It wasn't his campaigning, per se. It wasn't his personality, per se. It wasn't his track record, per se. It wasn't his speech, per se. It wasn't his debate performances, per se. Those weren't the deciding factors for O'Toole. The deciding factors for O'Toole was he did not clearly and cleanly distinguish himself from Trudeau. Singh also had the same problem, and the Greens also had this problem. This NDP, the Greens, and the Liberals in 2021 were all very close to each other. The main differentiating factor between the Liberals and the NDP wasn't philosophical, it wasn't ideological, it wasn't Canada should be this or that. They all agreed on what Canada should be. It's just a question of how fast. Trudeau wasn't campaigning staunchly that we need to keep dentistry privatized or that we needed to keep pharmacare privatized. He just wasn't campaigning that we needed to make it public. That's a very big difference. He wasn't campaigning against Singh on those issues. He was just not, those weren't issues for him. That doesn't make him a very different or distinct position from Singh to the average voter. Singh did not make a wedge issue between the Liberals and the NDP. He didn't create a dynamic or different vision of Canada. It was the same vision, just faster. And with no real wedge or distinguishing factor between the two parties. They seemed very similar. He managed to perform better because the Greens collapsed, but that wasn't his doing. That was the Greens just falling apart. Because the Greens and the NDP in 2021 were almost the same party. Even more so than Liberals and the NDP were. The Greens and the NDP had almost the same platform verbatim. The main differences that I could tell were the Greens wanted more climate action. Instead of 45%, they wanted 60% reduction. You know what? People full stop don't care about numbers. Like, you gotta keep in mind here, when you're talking about platforms, when you're talking about who's gonna win an election, numbers literally don't matter. Especially when you have very abstract numbers like carbon emission reduction. Do you personally know, off the top of your head, how many carbon emissions Canada makes? What 45% reduction means? What that target actually is? How much is more is 60% reduction? What are the results of this? If we had a 60% reduction in emissions, what would happen? What happens if we had a 45% reduction? You don't know, I bet. I don't know. And I bet almost no one knows. Yes, there's going to be scientists and ideologues and activists who know, maybe, or at least claim they know. But the important thing there is the average person probably has very little idea what that means. Same thing when you're talking about immigration quotas. Saying you want to reduce immigration by X amount or Y amount, or increase it by X amount or Y amount, doesn't really mean much to the individual voter because it doesn't really mean anything. Okay, you might be like 500,000 is a very big number, but what does that actually do? Yeah, a lot of people are coming here, but like, what does that mean? See my point? Or you try to argue about what the tax rate should be. You can say a broad thing, we should cut taxes or we should raise taxes. That is a position you can take. But saying we should cut taxes by 2% or we should cut taxes by 1%, if those are the two opposing viewpoints, you're going to have a very low turnout if that's the only issue in the election. You have an election between 1% tax cut or 2% tax cut, almost no one's going to vote because people aren't going to care. It's quite a bit of effort to go vote. And an issue 1 to 2% reduction in tax rate, it's extremely unclear what that really means. I can tell you how much money you're going to have more in your pocket, but there's going to be other effects. And most people understand there are other effects of tax cuts than just you have more money. It's esoteric and complicated, and the difference between those two positions is so small. Now, the difference between cut taxes or raise taxes, that's a much larger difference that is more clear and more obvious and is more likely to get people to care. But this is the important thing. Numbers themselves are irrelevant. That's why you look at a lot of platforms, they're kind of loosey-goosey with numbers, because numbers are difficult to convey to somebody. Some numbers are really clear, like you could say we had a 100% increase in homicides. Yeah, people will be like, oh, wow, that's really bad. That's bad. Those numbers, sure. But then if you go to say, to combat the 100% increase in homicides, we're going to increase the police force by 30% or 50%. Oh, I don't know what the difference between those two would be. Would there be any difference? I don't know. I bet you don't know either. But no one knows. I bet even the politicians saying 30 or 50% increase in policing doesn't know. And that's the really important thing here. When you're creating a platform, when you're running an election, it's not just about doing good policies. Those are huge and important and crucial. Don't do bad policies. That's dumb, obviously. But it's more important than just having good policies. You have to have things that are memetic, understandable, and different. For example, Poilievre's promise to defund the CBC to a tune of $1 billion might seem like it violates Rule 1 I just did, where you shouldn't really push numbers. But the thing is, $1 billion is such a gargantuan sum of money. And the left has already primed people in general to be apprehensive about billionaires, so the idea of billions is already unappealing to people. Just on average. Find anyone who's really going to defend a billionaire, for example. Even if the billionaire did something right, it's going to be hard to find people to defend them. That saying something like that kind of plays in two ways. It immediately contrasts with the liberal position of increasing funding to the CBC, and it plays into the layperson being apprehensive about spending gargantuan sums of money. Because it's one thing if the Poilievre was saying $1 million, people wouldn't care. People would look at $1 million and be like, but we spend like $500 million a year, or whatever the actual federal budget is. I think it's 400 billion, sorry. So 1 million on 400 billion, you're talking about chump change. Like, that's not a really big deal. I don't really care about that. You're talking about $1 billion, you're now talking about 0.25% of the budget. That's quite a bit of money. And it's $1 billion. It's the same ballpark range as 400 billion. They're both billions. It's a lot. It's a lot more significant. It's a lot more, it evokes more feeling. And then you also have the fact that it is a red meat issue for the base. The base doesn't like CBC, so it's also a winning issue there. But the important thing here is that it's different and visceral to the average person. You don't need to know much about federal budgets to know $1 billion is a lot of money. When you're talking about saving $1 million, well, it's a good amount of money, but like we spend so much money. Would we even notice that? Probably not, because $1 million on 400 billion is like what is that, like 0.000 something percent? Like we're like 40% of the budget. Like it's a rounding error. And that's the big thing here. So Poilievre is running a good campaign, sort of. It's not an election, it's not really a campaign. But he has nailed down a position that is clear and contrasting with the Liberals. And that's one of the reasons why he's outperforming O'Toole quite significantly. If we go here for a second, put it over here in the corner, we have here, November 13th, the Conservatives at 37.6. They're up 3.9 points from 2021. It's been just about a year. We are talking a huge swing for the Conservatives here. Gargantuan swing. They're taking some ground from the Bloc, some from the PPC, some from the NDP, etc. Very large swing here. Very, very large. So, what? Right? Does that mean he's a shoo-in here? No. Campaigns matter. Messaging matters. Platforms matter. He's doing really well right now, but it's not a shoo-in. He still needs to run a good campaign. He still needs to run a clear, concise, and understandable message that is clearly distinguishable from the Liberals. He's been doing that, for sure. But the question remains, will he maintain this position in face of all calls from all sorts of people, which still occur, that he should moderate, he should pivot, or whatever? It goes back to the core thing in conservatism. Most people in conservatism, in campaigning, in elections, in government, who are conservatives, legitimately don't understand how they won their election, how to win an election, how to govern. You see anecdotes all the time popping up. This is really common in the US, but it happens everywhere else, where you'll hear about so-and-so politician polls every single time before they do an action. You gotta be kidding me. If you have to take affirmative polling before you know what to do, you shouldn't be in government. Polls are a very useful tool. Don't get me wrong. But you cannot govern by poll. A lot of people don't know the other options. If we were to have a poll right now saying, should we restrict gun ownership, it probably would say the majority of Canadians agree. Okay. But the majority of Canadians don't understand intrinsically what that actually means. So by polling that we should restrict it and then going to do that, yes, technically speaking, that might be popular, but then you look into details and you find out, oh, actually your base isn't like that, that's a problem. But the important thing is that's not a way to govern and keep the conservative base happy. Because they want you to be conservative. They want you to take conservative actions. They want you to be proactive. You can't be proactive if you're polling every decision. This is representative government, not direct democracy. A representative, a premier, an MP, a prime minister is empowered to do things. That's the point of the executive. That's the point of the legislature. They do things proactively. And this is where it really gets in the rub with conservative politics. A lot of conservatives, full stop, are scared of their conservatism. Now, a large portion of that is because the media is much more aggressive at holding conservatives accountable on things. And in fact, I would say in Canada in general, it's rare to see liberals held accountable for things. It does occur. Don't get me wrong. There's some good journalism in some places, and there are good journalists. An example, Nova Scotia, that former Liberal Premier Ian Rankin was taken to roost over DUI charges he had when he was younger. And that was one of the big reasons why he ended up losing that election in 2021. So it does happen. It's just, in general terms, more people in media, more people in journalism are willing to hold conservatives accountable than they are willing to hold liberals. And this also happens in places like Twitter, with citizen journalism, or other things. And a lot of time, conservatives also hold themselves more accountable than liberals hold themselves accountable, too. So you get more of that. But the thing is, just because you're getting a lot of pushback in the media doesn't mean you're wrong in your policy. It can mean you're wrong. And that's where governing and the skill in leadership matters. Sometimes outrage will occur that is irrelevant. It's fake outrage, it's phony, or it doesn't matter. Or it's people who are going to be mad anyways, no matter what you did. But sometimes it's actually real anger. Two recent examples, relatively speaking. Doug Ford using an notwithstanding clause. A lot of people in Ontario, a lot of them, were very angry. Now, it was mostly not his base, but a lot of people were really angry at him. Okay. That was real anger. Now, I feel like he looks kind of dumb to have walked back the notwithstanding clause use so quickly, but I don't think he was entirely wrong. I think probably should never have used it to begin with. Or if he was going to use it, he should have been willing to hold his line longer, but regardless, I don't think he's entirely wrong to back down in face of all of that pressure. Because, yes, his base mostly didn't mind, but a lot of people were angry. And it had the potential of spiraling out into a bigger problem on a social level. Okay. A different example, this is the US, to be fair. Ron DeSantis in Florida. In early March, April this year, he took a very strong line against what's it called? With the Parental Rights and Education Bill. And he got a lot of pushback, a lot of media anger against him about the Parental Rights and Education Bill. But the thing is, the reason why that's different than what happened in Ontario is the media pushback in Ontario was reflecting grassroots pushback as well. There were actual people angered about this. Like a large amount of people angered by this. The Parental Rights and Education Bill in Florida, overwhelmingly popular in Florida. The media was really angry with DeSantis, but his voters were not angry. And that's the difference. You have to know when you're doing something that actual voters care about, that don't like, know when to pivot, and know when to pick your battles. Sometimes you should do something that's extremely unpopular because it is the correct thing to do. It's the morally right thing to do. This is an old example, but banning slavery was very unpopular when slavery was still legal in a lot of places. That doesn't mean banning slavery was a bad idea. It just means you have to know when to use your political capital. And in places like Canada, with Conservatives, we often have politicians who don't know anything. I use this example a lot. O'Toole, 2021, backed away from his gun control policy. That sunk him his campaign. He was walking to a minority government because people were that mad at Trudeau that they were willing to anti-vote him. But O'Toole sunk his party immediately by flip-flopping. Yes, he was getting a lot of media pushback about it. And yes, there are real grassroots people in Canada who really want more gun control or really supported Trudeau's gun bans. But that doesn't mean caving to them is the politically correct decision, is the morally correct position, or is the pragmatic position. In the space of an election, it's actually the opposite of several of these. In an election, a wedge issue that makes the other side really angry and makes your side really excited is what you want. And this is one thing that Conservatives are really bad at, in general terms, in the US and Canada and the UK and other English-speaking countries. They're really bad at wedge issues. The Liberals, the Democrats, the Labour, whatever party you want to talk about, are very good at executing wedge issue politics. In the case of 2021, the Liberals clearly used guns as a wedge issue to leverage out their their urban core base. They also used abortion to leverage out their base, even though there was literally no differences between both parties' abortion policies, etc. There's other ones too, but those are the two big ones. They successfully used wedges like that. And those things are, generally speaking, very controversial and not popular positions. Less so on abortion in Canada, but in general terms, it's still controversial and not a very popular position. A lot of people get really annoyed that it always comes up, for example. But smart use of wedges is how you win an election. That's not necessarily how you should govern, but it's how you win an election. And this is the big thing here, to tie this all up. Poilievre is doing a good job right now in leading the Conservative Party. He's created a contrasting, different vision to the Liberals, and he seems to be willing to play the wedge issue game. And he seems to be smart and adept at using his political capital to leverage things that excite his base, while at the same time not offending swing voters, or, at minimum, not riling up the opposition. That is how you win an election. And that's why he's leading right now, and why he's set to win if an election occurs. That doesn't mean, if you're a Conservative in Canada, you should take this for granted. If you take a win for granted, you get what the Republicans got this last week. But it is to say they're in a good position right now. And going forward, I think it will probably stay this way. And this is also why Singh is in a progressively worse position. He doesn't have a different platform than the Liberals. It's basically the same platform. He isn't distinguishing himself in action from the Liberals. He's literally propping up and supporting their government in every way, shape, and form. He has created no meaningful wedge issues from the Conservatives or the Liberals to distinguish himself. Or, if not created, championed any wedge issues. And he doesn't seem to care to do any of these things. The polls seem relatively favorable right now for the NDP, but they always do. The NDP is almost always overpolled, especially in between elections. The Liberals and the Conservatives are always underpolled. And this is important. Conservatives being underpolled is relatively common. Liberals are underpolled consistently in Canada. You look right now at the overall polling average. There's raw polling here. There's one poll that has the Liberals within margin of error of my model. Almost every... I guess you could consider this Nano's poll too. But that's way too high. But anyways, the general term is the Liberals are underpolled as much as the Conservatives are in Canada. And that's because the NDP might legitimately be popular at 19%, but they don't run a different campaign from the Liberals, and they don't run a very wedge issue heavy or motivated campaign. So there might be a lot of voters who are like, I like the NDP more, but they're in a riding that Liberals are going to win, and they don't care to vote. If you're in downtown Toronto, and it's Liberal NDP swing district, and sure, you might like the NDP more, but Liberals are just as good. Are you going to go vote? Some will, sure, but a lot won't. So, yes, maybe it's not so much that the Liberals and the Conservatives are underpolled. It could just be that the NDP always underperforms because they under Singh, that is, because Singh runs bad campaigns. But that is why we're in this situation. And I wouldn't be surprised if Singh's leadership continues, the NDP might just die federally. Though there's enough provincial parties that would be very difficult. But with that, I will finish this up here. If you liked the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe. Comment below what you think here. If you thought this dissection was too detailed or went too long, if I missed something. If you see any writings that look really sus, let me know. There's 338 writings, and someone who might be, if you're from an area, you probably have a better feel for that writing than I do. So you might be able to point out something, or I could have made a mistake. There was one guy, I think his screen name was Hello, which is hilarious, in one of the US videos where he pointed out that some of the Colorado districts looked sus. And he's right, they were sus. My bad. I'll get into that in the US midterm post-mortem later. But it does happen. With the resources of myself, I sometimes erroneously categorize things, or I make mistakes, or whatever, or I make wrong assumptions. Your comments, your suggestions, your ideas are super useful to make sure that I can fix those or I can avoid those. So please comment. And with that, I bid you all adieu, and I will hopefully see you next week. I will I always do this at the end of the video. I was just going to put an update note here. The upload schedule is going to be decreased for the next bit because there's really not many elections going on, and making more scripted or more detailed videos takes longer to make. But with that, I am hoping to see you next week with a US postmortem, but if there's still a meaningful amount of votes uncounted, you won't. But I'm hoping by 12 days after an election that they will have counted almost all the votes. That would be really bad. Otherwise, see you next time.